Hi, today on the Smurf Garage Workshop, I'm going to show you how I built this bench that came out of the trash pile. Not only did the brackets come out of the trash pile, but this wood was buried in the mud for years, and I basically milled it down and turned it into this bench. So I'm going to show you how I did that. And I did this a couple weeks ago when it was 50 degrees warmer than it is today. So let's get to it. So this bench had been put out on the curb on trash day by one of my neighbors. And my wife saw it and said, hey, you should go rescue that bench. And so I did. And this thing's been basically taken apart and living in our shed for 2 years. And so today is the day I'm going to rip it out of that shed and I'm going to start putting this thing back together and turn it into a bench that we can use. The reason this was thrown away is because all the ends on the slats are all broken. One of the brackets on the bottom is missing, and that caused the whole bench to rack back and forth and eventually just wallow out and break the slats. So I'm going to basically paint this, produce all new slats for it, and put it back into service in our front yard. So in the springtime, I basically saw online someone was giving away all this wood. And I went over and picked up all this wood, and come to find out, this wood was all, I think there were parts of a shed, parts of a previous planters in this lady's backyard. And I found it was in the springtime, and it was right after we had a bunch of rains. And this stuff was buried in mud. So it's been drying out on my wood rack, and it needs to get out of here because they've got a load of firewood coming for the winter. So I'm going to go ahead and pull all this wood out, and then I'm going to heave it over the fence into the front yard, and then I'm going to basically scrub all the dirt off of this because I need to clean all this wood up before it ever goes through my planer because I don't want to nick any of the blades on my planer from dirt embedded in this. So once all these boards were scrubbed, I laid them out in the driveway in the sun and let them all dry out a little bit. Now, I'm pretty sure this wood is Douglas fir or something of that nature. I did make sure it wasn't pressure treated because I don't want to be sitting on pressure treated wood. Not that it would matter that much, but still, it's definitely, it's not a hardwood. I was hoping it might have been something better, like cedar or something. I don't think it's cedar, but I think it's Douglas fir. You know, if someone's a woodophile and they can look at this and tell me what kind of wood it is, great. I know it's not going to last as long as the original slats, but you know what? This is free. And at some point, I'll buy some nicer wood to replace the slats with, but for now, this will get me through a few seasons. Next was the fun task of pulling out all the broken fasteners. Most of these are screws that had just been broken off, and they were a nightmare to get out. But it took me a while, but I got all the nails and screws out. Next, I took it over to the saw, and I basically cut off the edges. I wanted to clean up the edges on these so I can kind of get nice, clean, crisp edges to be able to then cut from. Once all the edges were cut off, then I ran the boards back through using an old slat to basically get a width. So here I'm using the width of a previous slat to kind of get the width I need, which I think, 2.5 inches or something like that. And then once I had that, I'm basically cutting that same size out of all of these boards, basically just grabbing the good sections. So any pieces that have big, huge knots and stuff, I'm just ignoring. So I'm trying to, out of these 2x8s, I'm trying to get, maybe 2 or 3 good slat pieces out of each one of those. And then each of those slat pieces then goes over to my bandsaw, and I go ahead and resaw it because I don't need slats that are almost 2 inches thick. So here I'm resawing this down, and that's going to basically give me a piece that's 3/4 of an inch wide. It's going to be a little smaller once I mill it or run it through the planer, but not much. So I'm going through and resawing all of these down right now, and then they're going to go through the planer. This is really to smooth everything out, take that rough edge off the one side, and just get back to a nice clean surface. The original slats were pretty square, but I actually wanted a rounded profile on them because they're more comfortable to sit on, and also there's less chance of you snagging your clothes on it. So basically all of the slats went through my router with a pretty good sized round over bit on them to give me a nice rounded edge. Next, I took some exterior rated wood filler, and I need to fill all the previous nail holes and any blemishes or knots or any kind of dings and dents that are in these slats. In this case, I'm actually using a body filler spreader like you'd put Bondo on with, and that works great for basically trying to get this filler in the holes. And then I let this filler dry overnight. I spread the filler on pretty thick and tried to cover up a lot of any kind of cracks in the grain or anything, so that's why it's spread on pretty heavily. But after a day of drying, basically the sander just makes quick work of this to level these back down. And then it was on to painting. Here I'm using an exterior, basically a deck stain. This is a semi-transparent deck stain. It'll cover up some of the grain. That way I won't see any of the holes that I filled, but it's a little bit of the grain bleed through. and then they went out in the driveway in the bright sun to dry for a couple hours. While those were drying, it was time to clean up the brackets. These were in surprisingly good shape, a little bit of rust, but mostly just dirt, so they just needed a good scrubbing before I went ahead and started to paint them. And then it was on to painting them. Here I'm using some Rust Stop black paint. This stuff is really good for exterior projects, and it keeps any rust from coming back in short order. So I got one really heavy coat on one side. I let that dry off. I gave it another coat, and then I flipped it over and painted the other side. I always paint the non-visible side first, because then you're less chances of getting marks on it when you paint the good side. Okay, with the cast iron parts painted and the slat stained, we're ready to assemble this thing. And what are we going to assemble this thing with? Carriage bolts. That's what was used originally. Now, if you go and look for carriage bolts in the store, they're either going to come as just zinc-plated carriage bolts, or you can pay a ton of money and buy stainless carriage bolts. Now, you can buy zinc-plated carriage bolts and then paint them black, but they're probably not going to last very long out in the weather here. Outside of Chicago, we have pretty harsh winters. This thing isn't coming inside in winter. It's going to stay outside until it rots away and I have to paint it and replace the wood again. But what I found was these little carriage bolts. You can buy these at your local hardware store. Already powder coated black. But you won't find them in the hardware section. Where you find them is out in the fencing department. And these little guys, you buy a bag of them. These are used for putting chain link fences together, especially black chain link fences. And they're already powder coated. And they're the exact right size to go into this bench. So that's what I'm going to use, is these black powder coated carriage bolts. All right, so with that, let's start assembly. Assembly is challenging on this. You can't really just put the parts in and kind of stick the slats in one by one. There's kind of a channel they ride in. So you got to get all one side in and then get all the other side in. So that made it fun with one person trying to do this. I really should have had my wife help me, but live and learn. And so once all of those were in, I tightened them all down, and then we were ready to move on to the bottom brace. So I had to basically mark the center position of where that bottom brace is going to go, and then I lay it in, and then I use some small screws. I think these are just half-inch. These are half-inch screws. They're just galvanized. I couldn't find any black ones. I wasn't going to search for them too far, and I just go ahead and screwed them in place, and that kind of helps distribute the load when you're sitting on it across all the slats. Okay, now the bench is together. We're done, right? Well, we're not done. The problem is when we got this bench, there's a part missing. And it didn't come with it when I found this thing sitting on the side of the curb. One of the things that was missing is there's a support bar that goes from here to here. That bar is missing. There's no manufacturer on this thing. I don't know where to even order a part for it, so I'm gonna make it. And what I'm gonna make it from is kind of a couple pieces. Originally, this probably would have just had a tube, like steel tube across, hollow tube with nuts welded in the end, and then you bolted it on from the end. Probably what happened, because it happens every time they build something like that, the little nut where it's welded into the tube breaks off, and at that point the whole bracket is useless. So I'm going to make it, but I'm going to make it a little differently. So what I'm going to use is this thread-all, and you can buy this at hardware stores. This is 5/16 thread-all, and it's the same size bolts as all the other bolts in here as far as the thread and pitch. Now I wanted to get one long piece of 4-inch thread-all. I went to 3 different stores. No one had a 4-foot long piece. They had 8-foot long pieces, but those were like $35. So I bought these 2-foot long pieces for like $3 and just bought a coupler. So I can just put them together and build as long as I need to. Now, this is really gonna provide all of the support, and it's gonna go from end to end. But I don't wanna leave it like this because this doesn't look very well. So what I did is bought a piece of 1/2-inch EMT electrical conduit. And you can kind of see the end of it. Even though this is fairly thin wall compared to like a plumbing pipe, this is guaranteed to be thicker than what was probably here originally. If you ever look at those when you put furniture together and they have those welded nuts in, the tube is usually very, very thin. This is pretty thick. And the reason I'm using 1/2 inch is because this will slide, even with these couplers, this will slide into here perfectly and stay centered. So now therefore with that threaded rod in there, the threaded rod is going to give strength to prevent the legs from splaying. And this pipe is going to prevent the legs from kind of towing in. So that's just going to keep it nice and rigid. So what I need to do is now is to cut everything down. So what I've done is cut the thread all down a little bit shorter than what I need, because these bolts are going to go in the end and screw into the couplers, and that way only that part of the bolt is going to show on the outside. I couldn't find these in black. I could have done something like a button bolt or something, but I had these already, and I'm just going to shoot, once these are together, I'll just shoot this bolt with a little black paint, the same as I shot the base with. And I'm also going to paint that entire piece of 1/2-inch conduit with black paint as well, so it'll all just kind of blend in. So right now I'm going to go through and cut up the 1/2-inch conduit. I've already cut the thread all, and then we'll start putting it together, and you'll see how this is all going to work. Okay, now that I've got this bar in place and mocked up and the legs even and spread exactly where I need them to be, I need to go ahead and measure this so then I know how long to cut that 1/2-inch conduit to. So in here I'm just going to go right from the end of the bracket to the other end of the bracket, and this looks like exactly 47 inches is what I'm going to go for here. So that's how long I'm going to cut this. So using a tubing cutter, I cut the EMT down to the right length. In this case, I'm trying to get this in here. Now, this where this bar sits, it's kind of inset a little bit, so I had to use the orange persuader to kind of knock the leg out a little bit, just so I could splay the legs enough to get that pipe into that recessed section. Okay, and with this bar in place, now all I got to do is just touch up the paint, and we're ready to go. So I'm going to move this outside. It's a chilly day here today. I think it's, I don't know, 44 outside right now. So maybe I'll try to spray it here in the garage and just put a tarp down over here, but we'll find out here. And I need to just spray this, give this a little bit of paint to protect it from the weather, and then it's ready to go in the garden. So let's do that next. So it absolutely was too cold to paint outside, so I put a tarp down over my bench and painted it inside. And I went ahead and opened the garage door up, and that just gave me enough ventilation to spray it, and then once I was done and let it ventilate for a little bit, I can close the garage back up. And there we go, we're done. So I've basically taken trash. One, this bench was trash. It was on the actual street, waiting for trash pickup. And then I took wood that it was basically sitting in the mud for God knows how long before I got it, let it dry out, milled it down, reproduced the slats, and I basically created this bench for essentially the cost of hardware that I had to buy. So maybe I spent less than $20 to refurbish this entire bench. Anyway, that's my video for this week. I hope you enjoyed it. It shows that not everything you see on the side of the curb is trash. It can be restored, reused, without spending a lot of money. Anyway, get out in the garage and do something, and I'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.